Hello, my dear viewers. I'm Olga Demchuk, a researcher of the inner world of personality. Today, I have prepared a topic for you: energy vampires. We're not going vampire hunting today or scanning the people around us. That's not the point here. I suggest that we focus first and foremost on ourselves and try to recognize the energy vampire mode within ourselves. Each of us enters this mode when we lack sufficient energy. And today, we'll try to break these states down into types to understand where they come from, why they arise, and how they impact the people around us. And of course, once you begin to notice these patterns in yourself, you'll also start to recognize them in your loved ones, friends, and those you interact with. It helps to notice when this energy vampire mode shows up so you can stay out of it. The first mode is the confirm I'm right mode. This is when someone is telling you something and your role, your lens, you're already predetermined. Most often, people condemn certain bad individuals or dramatically recount a story in which they are, without a doubt, the victim. They invite you to join in the righteous anger and in condemning those who are in the wrong. Why is this mode considered energy vampirism? Because the other person has no choice. When someone's in that confirm I'm right mode, they don't leave the other person any space to move, think differently, or even express an alternative view. That is, he offers him to service his own condition. If you try to step out of that script, they either won't hear you, or they'll get offended, or angry, or something else along those lines. Basically, it's all about pushing you into the role they've already assigned you. The second type of energy vampirism is serve my greatness. This occurs when another person starts boasting about how well they did in school, or about the awards they received, or about how they once had a wealthy life in the past. Or they start talking about their position of power or something else about how much they've achieved. And the conversation partner is expected to admire them and say, my goodness, you are so wonderful. Or to look at them with admiration in their eyes. This often happens when people have had a little to drink and enter a manic state. They want to amplify it, and so they start recalling various stories. Well, if it's not about achievements, then it's about how they won an argument, how they proved someone wrong or took the upper hand. In other words, they use their conversation partner as a stage on which they perform a scene of their own greatness. The third point concerns energy vampirism. These are aggressive individuals. When you interact with them, you realize that if you do something wrong, they will get angry. That is, being around them brings about a fear of their anger. These people may not express their anger openly. That is, they control it, they restrain it, but you understand that this outburst can happen instantly and unexpectedly. Such individuals often get angry at waiters, at drivers. They look for opportunities to get into conflicts in order to release their own aggression. People often feel intimidated by them. And when you're around this kind of energy, why do we call it energy vampirism? Because you don't get to be free either. Their anger pushes you down a narrow track, the one they want you to follow, whether you realize it or not. You can see it in their body. Their face may turn red, their jaw clenches, fists tighten, all that tension is held inside, just below the surface. This is what we call the fourth mode of energy vampirism. These are fragile people who seem to be constantly wounded. That is, if in our previous example there was open anger, here there is a constant sense that you are causing pain. In other words, you are afraid to say anything to this person because it will hurt them. They might roll their eyes and say something like, "Oh my God, how can you even say that? Are you serious?" Is it really okay to speak like this? And being around them, you often feel tense and self-conscious because they keep casting you as the one doing harm, while they always seem to stay in the role of the wounded victim. In fact, this is a desire to make others conform to their own system of values. In other words, the aggressor we discussed in the previous point and these sufferers are essentially the same. Both want things to be the way they want them to be. The first type shows open aggression, but these ones, they're passive aggressive. They make you the aggressor and you keep hurting them. Type 5, the self-absorbed. They are not like those we discussed in the second point. That is, they do not boast about their achievements. On the contrary, their behavior is always carefully measured and considered. In this behavior, they are modest, courteous, excessively polite, self-possessed, and composed. And when you find yourself next to such a person, you begin to feel almost inevitably like a butterfly pinned with a needle. This needle imposes a certain type of behavior on you. You can't step to the side or break out of the script you're locked into it, just moving along the same track, like a puppet following preset moves. That is, within this behavior, you have no opportunity to be truly alive. This person themselves exists in a frozen puppet-like state and invites you to enter the same puppet state, so that nothing happens in any way that does not fit their puppet world. Around such people, you feel frozen, as if you have to cover your entire life and all your vital energy with a thin or even thick layer of ice in order not to step outside the scenario that has been offered to you. Point 6. Point 6 is moralists. People who become moralists are often those who are engaged in some form of self-restriction, for example, vegetarians. I'm not saying that all vegetarians are like this, but there are people who, for example, give up meat or alcohol or who don't smoke themselves. And because of this, they feel superior. In other words, it's as if they tolerate you, but this is a kind of pitiful tolerance. These are the kind of pitiful people who, for example, eat meat. I have encountered many such individuals in the field of esotericism. There, people act as if they have touched upon some kind of spiritual knowledge, and they regard everyone else as inferior. When a person belongs to some sect or is a fervent believer in any kind of cult, it is as if they become an envoy of that cult, a representative of some higher powers. It's as if this flow goes through him, and other people are worse, he tolerates them. Why is this considered energetic vampirism? Because the other person is assigned the role of being inferior, you are by default worse than I am. And so self-affirmation occurs at the expense of another person. After the moralists, the seventh category we have are those who know better. This type of energetic vampirism is similar to that of the moralists. But while moralists suggest conformity to certain moral standards or principles, those who know better choose, for example, a single aspect and use it as a means of self-affirmation. I think you have encountered such people when you enter high-end brand stores, and the salespeople working there seem to perceive themselves as if they belong to some sort of higher caste. And they evaluate the person in front of them. They check whether the person can actually afford our brand. It could be someone in a managerial role, even if he's just supervising junior janitors. He still acts like a true boss, walking around with an invisible crown on his head. But it could just as well be a taxi driver or a salesperson. For some reason, he considers himself superior, and they also assign the role of someone lesser. The eighth type are the manic emptiers. People swept up in a constant storm of events, always in motion, always dragging you along. There's always something going on around them, and once you're in their orbit, it's like being pulled into a spin cycle, thrown around and cast in some chaotic role, just to play along with their latest drama. And around such people, there's a constant sense of being violated. It feels as if you are following them, but you end up leaving drained and even somewhat depressed. Why is this considered energetic vampirism? Because others become extras in the manic scenario. And without other people, the manic drainers, the depleters, cannot play out their scenario. And the other person as an individual does not interest them. They are only interested in others as staff serving their mania. The ninth point concerns anxious people. They carry a lot of anxiety inside, a lot of fear, and they bring this chaos, this fear, and it feels as if they want to slow you down or structure themselves through you. I want to clarify that we are not discussing personality types, but rather modes of behavior. We can find ourselves in an anxious mode when we are afraid, for example, when we are under stress. And in such moments, we become energy vampires. We need another person in order to use them for our own purposes, in other words, to drain their energy. In an anxious state, a person becomes chaotic, and it's not even about acting quickly, their actions are just senselessly chaotic. You can hear it in how they speak like scraps of old newspapers. You have to strain just to piece together some kind of meaning. This person does not realize their own illogical behavior. They are unaware of their destructiveness in that moment. They exist in their own world, where they are doing everything they can to contain their anxiety. In other words, they are no longer focused on building communication. At that moment, they are caught up in a kind of internal tornado. And such a person may appear quite frozen on the outside. But this frozen state is deceptive. In their presence, you can sense the overwhelming chaos inside them. It is similar to a thundercloud that keeps approaching, and you do not know whether it will rain or not. And the slightest inconsistency or mismatch can tear this cloud apart, causing some emotion to pour out of the person. The anxiety inside is undoubtedly connected to the inability to acknowledge one's own emotions. When a person does not acknowledge them, they cannot even begin to structure this chaos within themselves, let alone understand that they are experiencing chaos. Right now, I am anxious. For example, I often repeat this phrase to myself when something happens, and I notice that I start dropping things, or I start talking, hear myself from the outside, and realize that I am already beginning to say something nonsensical. I tell myself, right now, I am anxious. So the first thing you need to do is notice it, otherwise you become destructive and draining toward other people. Right. 10th point. These are people who are in a state of protest. I think you have also experienced this state. When someone suggests something to you, you immediately say no, without thinking it over, without delving into it, just an immediate no. When a person is also going through certain processes, their personal boundaries become like a thin shell. For example, if a person is overwhelmed with anxiety, they restrain themselves. And this self-restraint seems to thin out their protective shell. In other words, if personal boundaries are strong enough, they can withstand stress. But when emotional tension builds up, it starts to erode them, and the person becomes as if protected only by a thin eggshell. And just in case, he rejects everything that is said to him. They say no to everything. Why is this considered energetic vampirism? Because such a person is constantly in opposition. It feels like you're crashing into a wall into them, and suddenly you realize there's nothing coming back. No reaction, no emotional feedback. It's like facing an armored vehicle. They're fully sealed off, and while they might say something or offer a response, they can't actually meet you, connect with you, or respond in a human way. It's all one-sided. You reach out, and nothing comes back. At that moment, you feel powerless, useless, and meaningless. There is a similar type as well. This is the 12th point. These are people who are blind and deaf. This is when a person is overly self-absorbed and he's not in protest, but he does not hear you at all. In other words, you say something to them, but they respond as if they're not reacting to your words or your speech. He exists in his own world. Many of my clients, I ask my clients to record audio or video of our sessions. They say, I realized that I was responding inappropriately. In other words, you ask one question and I answer a different one. So in a state of stress, we begin to disconnect from the world. And in this state, other people start to feel like they don't exist for us at all. And this undoubtedly will drain a great deal of energy because it triggers self-attack and self-doubt about your own worth. After some time, it is possible to recover. But initially, being around a person who is blind and deaf to you will have a depleting effect because it causes you to question your own value. And finally, the 12th point, scandalmongers. These are the hysterical types who endlessly love to sort out relationships. They go around in circles, discussing the same things over and over. They repeat themselves constantly. And this is not about clarifying the relationship, but rather a kind of petty squabble where a person tries in every possible way to prove they are right and to present their point of view in different guises. In other words, these are people who draw you into some kind of emotional, draining, and pointless conflicts. We need to talk. Especially in written communication, they always feel the need to clarify or sort something out. And in written exchanges, you need to be particularly careful with such people because if you get involved, it will feel like an endless argument with no logical conclusion. Because the goal isn't to resolve anything, it's to prove they're right, just framing it differently, dressing it up, like I said, in new packaging. These are 12 types of behavior that, for those around, amount to a kind of emotional vampirism. They feel uncomfortable too, even those who seem manic or boastful. And as we discussed, the self-absorbed types, so tightly controlled, keeping themselves in check at all times, and expecting you to do the same to stay just as composed, just as rigid. These modes are not particularly pleasant for the person themselves either, but they require external reinforcement because this mode is not viable on its own in reality. And that is why other people around them become a backdrop for such behavior. Share your insights. If you are brave enough, write, what kind of energy vampire am I? You can also analyze and add which other modes of energy vampirism you are familiar with. Expand on my words. Share your insights. And now I'd like to invite you to stay with this project. It's called Exploring the Inner World of Personality. I post new videos here every week. So follow the channel to stay updated. This channel is about exploring the inner world, learning more about yourself, growing, healing from within. So subscribe, and I'll say goodbye for now. See you soon.